Hey there folks, Mr. K, the mediocre painter here, and I think I said in my last episode that I was going to talk about paint the next time I actually got around to doing a video, and predominantly around what paint you should buy and how you actually go about picking colours for your minis, that kind of thing. And after the last video, myself and my housemate assembled some push fit miniatures together. And they were from the Shadespire box set, which is over here. And frankly, my housemate has never assembled miniatures before, push fit or otherwise, in his life, and he really struggled to actually put together the push fit miniatures. It was the Stormcast Eternals that I have here that were a particular problem for him, and they are kind of tricky because the head sort of balances in place and then you have to put another piece over the top of it and get it all lined up and pushed together, and it's frankly very tricky. And I've said this before, these are supposed to be easy to build miniatures, but frankly they're just easier to build, and in some cases just slightly easier to build. So I thought I would do a video to sort of describe some tips and tricks in terms of making your life a bit easier when you actually come to push fit these miniatures together. And I have a selection in front of me of push fit miniatures from different box sets. So over here on my right I have some red orcs from Blitz Bowl, which is only available in the United States, sadly, and is basically a simplified version of Blood Bowl. It's absolutely excellent, and if you haven't already got it and you don't own Blood Bowl, I suggest you do get it. These yellow miniatures here are the humans from the same Blitz Bowl set, and I have here some Poxwalkers from the First Strike set, which I've done a review for, Death Guard or Plague Marines, and Primaris Marines from the First Strike set as well. And then I have a series of Shadespire miniatures here, Stormcast Eternals, some Chosen Axes, and Thorns of the Briar Queen. They all behave kind of differently when you push fit them together. And so just to give you an idea of the tricky ones and the not so tricky ones and the best ones and so on. Firstly, the ones that didn't really push fit together were actually these orcs from the Blitz Bowl set. There's actually several miniatures here where it doesn't really matter how hard you push fit these things together, the arm was going to fall off, the head was going to fall off, etc. So they had to be glued. No matter what you do, you're going to have to glue bits and pieces there just to make them actually work for you in the game, which is a bit disappointing, but there you go. But if you're looking to paint these things, and not everybody is, I admit that, you just want to get on and play the game, then you really should be looking to glue them together, but you've still got to figure out how they push fit together before you even do that anyway. The easiest ones are actually these yellow miniatures from the Blitz Bowl set. Now the yellow plastic is actually slightly softer than the other plastics that you see here. It's pretty clear actually that the red plastic used for the orcs, because the orcs are a very angular, sculpted mini, they've got a harder plastic. The red is definitely the hardest of all these plastics that you see here. But this yellow is slightly softer, and I'm assuming that in order to get the yellow colour, the polymer that they use has to be slightly less dense, and as a consequence of which, these push fit together really nicely and really well, because there's a little bit of give in the plastic, so you can push fit them together a little better. The most difficult ones were actually the Primaris Marines. The Primaris Marines are a little tricky when it comes to the arms. The arms basically, shoulder pads, the arm notches are like this, and the arms sort of slot onto the notch and twist down and around. And it's a little bit hard to get your head around when you're actually push fitting these things together when you do that. And so as a consequence of which, if you're anything like me, you'll snap them. And I ended up having to basically stick them together in the more traditional way. So the Primaris ones I actually found were the trickiest ones to do, and also what made them tricky as well are the heads. So the heads basically have a little notch on them, and they're supposed to sort of sit in the notch, and then you put the chest against the back whilst the head is there, and then it all tidies up. What you find is the actual notches on the actual head themselves get in the way of the poles that you're using to push fit the miniatures together, and so you have to do a little trim on them in order to be able to push fit these miniatures together. So it can be a bit of a pain to actually put them together. You know, the head goes flying everywhere and things like that, so it can be very difficult to put those things together, and you can get a bit frustrated. What I've found is that maybe if you put a bit of blue tack or a little bit of plasticine or something to maybe hold the mini in place, that you can make the head in place rather, so that you can actually push fit the stuff together, that would really be useful. But they're so tight you can't really do that. And you could try maybe putting a spot of super glue on there, but you know, that's kind of like, well, what's the point? You want to be only push fitting these things together as fast as possible so you can play with them. You want to glue them at a later date perhaps when you're actually thinking about painting them, which maybe never. The Shadespire miniatures are much better from a push fit perspective because they were better designed in the first place to be push fit. They are way better from a push fit perspective. The Stormcast Eternals, which are kind of like the fantasy equivalent of Marines, are the tricky ones, and again the reason why they're tricky is because that head has to sit in a notch and you're trying to line up the chest and the head falls out, and that's the reason why they are trickier to actually put together. The other ones are actually fairly good. The Chosen Axes were great to push fit together. The Briar Queen ones, the difficulty with those is actually visualizing how they actually go together and actually trying to be careful not to break them because they're so delicate. But these sculpts are absolutely incredible in the Shadespire series. They are, I think, the best miniatures that Games Workshop has ever produced. They are absolutely superb, and so you just have to be a bit careful when you do the Briar Queen ones when you actually push fit them together. So tips for actually pushing them together and how you actually do it. Well, you'll start off obviously with a sprue like this, and hopefully if you watch my video about the tools that you need to actually get miniatures off sprue, you've bought yourself a pair of snips. And no doubt when you first see this you'll get all excited and you'll snip and get all the pieces off. That's actually a really bad idea, because I'm now going to say something quite controversial. You really need to read the instructions. Now I know a lot of you have just switched off now and there's tumbleweeds lying around, but you really do need to read the instructions. I've made the mistakes so you don't have to here, but you really need to have a look at the instructions before you assemble a miniature. And the reason being is, generally speaking, the parts for a given miniature are in numerical order, but not always. So this is Megor's Fiends from the Shadespire series, for example, and you can see that the first miniature that they're asking you to build is using parts 8, 9, 10, 11 and 12. Now at least on the Shadespire minis they have actually put them in sequential order. On the Blitzball ones they didn't, they were a bit all over the place, so it made it even more difficult to put together. But that box set was put together at a cost, so I can kind of understand why it might be like that. It was thrown together at the last minute. So you really need to focus on doing one miniature at a time and cut those pieces off. And then you're going to tidy up those pieces, get the extra flashing off using an X-Acto knife or one of those small knives that I recommended in my video. And then you'll be ready to basically push fit the sucker together. It's a good idea to have the instructions out in front of you when you do this, and try and have all the pieces in front of you kind of like they have in the instructions, just to help you visualize how they actually go together. The Briar Queen miniatures from Shadespire, for example, are actually really tricky to visualize in terms of how they actually put together, and so it's a really good idea to try and have it there in front of you and try and position it right based on the actual diagrams, so it makes it easier for you to work out. And eventually it'll click, you know, you'll rotate them around and you'll go, oh right, it goes together like that. Now, you may have looked out there and people are suggesting you have to make some trims to the poles and things like that when you push fit these minis together. And if you do decide that you're going to do that, if you are going to trim the poles to make them push fit together a little bit easier, do use a knife. Don't use your snips. If you use your snips, you'll crush the pole and make it square, not circular. And then you'll find you won't be able to push the things to get things into that hole, or you'll be filing and sanding and just spending more time basically trying to get it fettled enough so it'll actually go together. Again, I made the mistake there, so you don't have to. You do use a knife if you find you want to, if you do find you need to take a little bit off the pole in order for it to push fit together. And you may find on some of the minis that you do need to do that, but I have a tip that might mean that you don't ever actually need to do that. I'll be onto that in a moment. But if you do decide to take a little bit off the pole, make sure it's like 1 mil and just take that off and use a knife so it's a nice clean cut, and then just sand it around so it'll actually smoothly fit into the actual hole. Now, top tip here, when you are push fitting these miniatures together, have the instructions in front of you as you're doing it, as I said, but also there is a little trick. If you are a cyclist and you want to lubricate things, then you'll probably find that you've got in your toolbox this kind of spray. This is a multi-purpose silicone spray. Not WD-40, this is a silicone spray. This stuff basically makes surfaces much more friction free, and so what I recommend is spray a little bit into the cap of the can, and then get a brush and dedicate a brush to actually do this as well, and then just get a little bit of it on your brush and then just put it on the poles like so, and you'll find that the miniature will push fit together much more easily, and you won't have to use your strength of the bear to push fit the miniature actually together. It will go together much easier and also much closer to the other side of the actual mini. And I found that this is a really good way of actually putting together push fit miniatures fast, and it doesn't seem to affect anything in terms of then subsequently painting later on at a later date. Now obviously you don't want to spray it everywhere, that's why I recommend you use a bit of a brush so that you're more precise, but it makes life so much easier doing it this way. You can see I push fit this dog from Agor's Fiends or Hellhound or whatever it is very quickly, and that's basically because I'm using this silicone stuff to put it together. And in particular where it can be tricky is pushing it into the base, and you may have to find you just got to rotate it a little bit from backwards and forwards in order to get it in, but if you add the silicone spray, boom, goes straight in, no problem. That could be particularly useful with the delicate minis like the Thorns of the Briar Queen, where you're actually, you know, constantly sort of going, oh, I'm gonna break it. If you use the silicone spray though, it just goes in really nice and easy. But like I say, don't go crazy with it, just put a little bit on the brush and a little bit on the poles and it'll push fit together, and you know, eventually it kind of, you know, dries out and goes away anyway. But that's a really good way to fast push these things together. So there's my tips. Hopefully you'll find that useful and you'll have a hassle-free experience when you actually come to push fit your miniatures together so that you can play Shadespire or Blitzball or get going with your first strike set. Thanks very much for watching. If you like it, please subscribe, and I'll be doing more videos soon. Bye.